A ground crew sergeant walking behind the right wing of a B-17 at Biskra airfield, Algeria, sees the tail and stops moving. The rear fuselage of the aircraft, everything aft of the radio compartment, has separated almost completely from the front. A strip of aluminum skin, maybe 18 inches wide along the top spine, is the only structural piece still holding the empennage to the airplane. The left horizontal stabilizer is gone entirely. The right one is shredded. Control cables stretched across the gap are taut as guy wires on a radio tower, and they are doing structural work that frames and stringers used to do. The date is February 1st, 1943. The aircraft, a B-17F-5BO carrying serial number 41-24406 and the name All-American 3 lettered on her nose, has just flown roughly 90 minutes through Axis-controlled airspace from a harbor on the Tunisian coast back to an airfield on the edge of the Sahara. The pilot, First Lieutenant Kendrick R. Bragg Jr. of the 414th Bombardment Squadron, 97th Bombardment Group, 12th Air Force, climbs down from the cockpit, walks aft to look at the tail, and says nothing for several seconds. None of his 10-man crew is wounded. The hydraulic system is destroyed. The tail wheel never came down. The flaps did not extend. By the time the photographs reach Stars and Stripes and the wire services in March, the picture of All-American 3 on the apron at Biskra, the entire rear half of the airplane appearing to dangle from the front, becomes one of the most reproduced images of the American Air War. Engineers at Boeing in Seattle pin a copy to a wall to argue, internally, about how the airframe stayed in one piece. The basic facts are documented in the squadron's mission log and confirmed by the bombardier, the tail gunner, and German aircrew who witnessed the collision from other aircraft in the engagement. A Messerschmitt Bf 109 struck the tail of the B-17 during the run home from Bizerte. The German pilot was killed, and Bragg's airplane should not have flown. To understand what kept her in the air, and what shaped the decisions Bragg made between the moment of impact and the moment his wheels touched dirt at Biskra, you have to start where the 97th was in early 1943 and what it was doing in Algeria in the first place. In late October 1942, after flying the first American heavy bomber missions over occupied Europe out of Polebrook in England, the group was peeled away from the 8th Air Force and sent south to support Operation Torch. By December, its B-17s were operating out of Biskra under Major General James H. Doolittle's 12th Air Force, hammering the ports through which Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was being resupplied. The crews were living in tents. The runway was packed dirt. The dust got into the turbochargers. Every morning, the intelligence officer drew a line on a wall map between Biskra and a port on the Mediterranean, and that line was where the day's casualties were going to come from. On the morning of February 1st, the line on the map ended at Bizerte. The 97th Bombardment Group had been the test case for daylight precision bombing. On August 17, 1942, 12 of its B-17Es flew from Polebrook to the Rouen-Sotteville marshalling yards in northern France, the first American heavy bomber strike on occupied Europe, with Brigadier General Ira Eaker riding in the lead aircraft, an airplane named Yankee Doodle. The group's commanding officer at the time was Colonel Frank Armstrong. The crews lost no aircraft on that first mission. They were treated, briefly, as the answer to a strategic argument that had been running since 1935. Could bombers operating in daylight, at high altitude, in tight defensive formation, hit factories and rail yards and survive enemy fighters? 3 months later, the answer was being complicated. Operation Torch landed in French North Africa on November 8, 1942, and General Dwight Eisenhower needed heavy bombers in the Mediterranean. The 97th was selected. It moved through Maison Blanche, near Algiers, and then south to Biskra in late December, a town at the foot of the Ores Mountains, where the runway had been bulldozed out of the desert floor a few weeks before. Lieutenant General Karl Toohey Spots commanded the Northwest African Air Forces from headquarters at Algiers. Doolittle, by then wearing 2 stars after the April 1942 Tokyo raid, ran the strategic bombing campaign in theater. The targets were Tunisian, the ports of Tunis, Bizerte, Sousse, and Sfax, through which Axis convoys were running men and tanks across the Narrows from Sicily into the Tunisian bridgehead. Every ton of ammunition Rommel's Panzer Army Africa fired at the British 8th Army or the U.S. 2nd Corps had been offloaded at one of those 4 harbors. The bombers' job was to make the harbors unusable. Kendrick Bragg's crew had been assigned to the 414th Squadron and to All-American 3 sometime in late 1942. The aircraft was new, a B-17F variant with the staggered waist windows, a Bendix chin turret installed under the bombardier's position to give the nose some defense against the head-on attacks German fighter pilots had recently figured out worked very well against unmodified forts. Bragg was a quiet 24-year-old from North Carolina, a graduate of pilot training in the Gulf Coast Training Center and transition training on four-engine aircraft at Hendricks Field, Florida. His co-pilot was Second Lieutenant G. Boyd Jr. The bombardier, Lieutenant Ralph Burbridge, sat ahead of and below them in the nose. The navigator was Lieutenant Harry C. Newessel. The flight engineer and crew chief was Staff Sergeant Joe C. James. The tail gunner, Staff Sergeant Sam T. Sarpoulos, would in less than a month be the man with the closest physical view of why his aircraft was about to come home in two pieces. They had flown a handful of missions out of Biskra by the morning of February 1st, runs to Tunis, Sousse, and an Italian airfield at Elmas on Sardinia. The flying out of Biskra was hard. The dust scoured engine bearings. There were no hangars. The mess was a tent. Pilots ate cold rations in the cockpit on the ground, while crew chiefs cranked engines and pulled propellers through by hand. Bragg's post-mission reports, on file with the U.S. Army Air Force's records now held at the National Archives at College Park, are written in the dry, declarative voice the AAF taught its officers to use. At 05:30 on February 1st, the intelligence officer of the 97th briefed the crews on the day's mission. The target was the port and submarine facilities at Bizerte. The estimated fighter opposition was significant. Bizerte sat on a deep-water inlet on the north coast of Tunisia, about 50 miles from Tunis, and by early 1943, the Axis was using it as a primary unloading point for tanks, fuel, and ammunition arriving from Sicily. The Luftwaffe fighter wings at the airfields around it, most importantly Jagdgeschwader 2 and elements of Jagdgeschwader 53, flying Bf-109Gs and FW-190s, had been ordered to defend the port at all costs. The flak around the harbor was concentrated and well-ranged, 88mm and 105mm guns sighted to cover both the approaches from the south and the run-in from the sea. American crews flying to Bizerte from Biskra came in from the southwest, climbed to bombing altitude over the desert, crossed the Tunisian coast, and made their bomb run with the sun behind them. The mission of February first put up roughly 24 B-17s, drawn from the 97th and 301st Bombardment Groups, flying in two boxes. All American 3 was assigned a position in the second box, on the left side of the lead element. Takeoff was at approximately 08:30. The aircraft climbed in formation through clear desert air to about 24,000 feet. Cabin temperatures at that altitude in unheated B-17 noses ran near -40°F. The crews wore electrically heated suits under wool, leather over the suits, and oxygen masks. Frostbite cases at the open waist gunners' positions were routine. The run to Bizerte took roughly 2.5 hours outbound. Burbridge, the bombardier in the nose of All-American 3, lined up his Norden through the chin glazing and called corrections to Bragg over the interphone in the last few minutes before the drop. The formation released its bombs over the harbor between roughly 1100 and 1110 local time. Reports later filed with the 12th Air Force indicated hits on the docks, on warehouses, and on at least one merchant ship moored alongside. Flak through the bomb run was, by the crew's accounts, intense, but not as accurate as it had been over Tunis the week before. The bombers banked off the target to the west and started for home in formation. German fighters arrived a few minutes later. They came up out of the airfields around Tunis and Bizerte and concentrated on the second box. Standard German fighter doctrine against B-17 formations in early 1943 was the head-on attack, a frontal pass at closure rates near 500 miles an hour, cannons firing into the cockpit and nose, then a rolling breakaway over or under the formation. The chin turret on the B-17F was Boeing's first attempt to push back on that tactic. It did not always work. On this mission, the German fighters made several frontal passes through the formation, and on at least one pass they attacked from below as well, what American gunners called a 12 o'clock low pass. Sarpoulos in the tail and the ball turret gunner reported tracer streams from German cannons crossing through the formation. Two B-17s in the formation took serious hits. None had gone down by the time the Germans formed up for what appeared to be one more attack on the trailing element. The aircraft that came through next was a single Messerschmitt Bf-109. Its pilot has been variously identified in post-war accounts. with some sources naming an officer of Jagdgeschwader 2 and others giving different identifications. The Luftwaffe loss records for that sector on that date are incomplete. Whoever he was, the Bf-109 closed on All-American 3 from the front and slightly above, fired, and did not break off in time. The collision happened at roughly 11:35 local time on February 1, 1943, at approximately 24,000 feet over the Tunisian coast. The Bf-109 came in firing. Burbridge and the chin gunner returned fire from the nose. The top turret gunner fired across the cockpit roof at a closure that gave him roughly 2 seconds of tracking. Whether the German pilot was hit by .50 caliber fire in the cockpit before the collision, lost control of his aircraft, or simply misjudged his breakaway has never been definitively established. The accounts in the unit history of the 97th and the after-action statements collected from Bragg's crew agree on what happened next. The Messerschmitt struck the upper rear fuselage of All-American 3, just forward of the vertical stabilizer. The propeller and front section of the German fighter sliced into the top of the B-17's fuselage at the longerons, cutting through skin, stringers, and most of the load-bearing structure that joined the tail to the rest of the airplane. The left horizontal stabilizer was torn off entirely. Part of the vertical fin was sheared. The Bf-109 disintegrated. Wreckage from the German aircraft, fragments of engine cowling and propeller, went down trailing fire. The German pilot did not get out. Gunners watching from other ships in the formation reported seeing the 109 break apart and fall away. Inside All-American 3, the crew's first impression was that they had been hit by a heavy flak burst. The shock loaded the entire airframe. The controls in Bragg's hands went momentarily slack, then mushy. The aircraft yawed left and started to roll. Bragg fought it back to level by reflex, using ailerons and asymmetric throttle on his 4 Wright R1820 engines. The interphone came alive with shouting. Sarpalus, in the tail, reported that he could see daylight through the floor of his own gun position. The inside of the fuselage, looking forward from his station, no longer connected cleanly to the rest of the aircraft. The radio operator, near the brake, reported the same thing. The bomb bay doors were jammed. The hydraulic pressure gauge on the co-pilot's panel was reading 0. The right elevator was still attached and partially functional. The rudder cables, remarkably, were still connected, though damaged. Bragg held the airplane level and called for damage reports by station. Burbridge in the nose was uninjured. Neuessel was uninjured. The top turret gunner was uninjured. The waist gunners were uninjured. Sarpalus, in the tail, the man closest to the brake, was uninjured but effectively trapped. The catwalk back to his position had partially separated from the floor, and crawling forward across the gap risked completing the structural failure. Bragg told him to stay put and to keep his weight as far forward inside the tail compartment as possible. The radio operator, identified in unit records as Staff Sergeant Paul A. Galloway, clipped a safety line to himself before moving across the remaining section of floor to assess the gap. The B-17 was still flying. It was flying slowly, at about 130 indicated, with the tail wagging slightly in the slipstream and the airframe groaning every time the air loads shifted. Bragg's first decision was whether to give the bailout order. He had altitude. He had parachutes. The crew could have gone out the bomb bay and the waist windows and been on the ground in occupied Tunisia by 11:45. His second option was to order the crew to bail out and ride the airplane down himself. The third was to fly it home. He polled the crew over the interphone. He got the answer he expected. Bragg's crew chose to stay with the airplane. He started running through what he had left to work with. The 4 engines were undamaged. Fuel was adequate for the run back to Biskra at reduced speed. The aileron and elevator trim controls still responded. The rudder pedals were heavier than they should have been, but were not jammed. Flight instruments in the cockpit, including the artificial horizon and the airspeed indicator, were functioning. The C-1 autopilot, standard on the B-17F, was inoperative. The hydraulic loss had taken it offline along with the bomb bay doors, the flaps, the brakes, and the cowl flaps on the engines. The cowl flaps mattered because without them the engines would run hotter than rated on the long descent and approach. The brakes mattered for obvious reasons. The flaps mattered because the B-17 lands on flaps the way most aircraft do. Without them, the landing speed would be 20 to 25 knots higher than normal. The touchdown would be at a flatter angle, and the rollout would be longer than the dirt strip at Biskra was built for. Bragg took inventory and put the problems in order. First, get clear of fighter range. Second, hold the airframe together long enough to cross 400 miles of friendly and unfriendly territory. Third, figure out how to land an airplane whose tail wanted to fall off. Two other B-17s in the formation, alerted by the radio call, slid in on either side of All-American 3 to form a defensive escort and to provide visual confirmation of the damage. Pilots of those ships could see, looking across at Bragg's airplane, that the tail was visibly moving on its own axis relative to the front of the fuselage. A radio operator on one of the escorting aircraft later said in debrief that he had thought, watching it, that he was about to see a B-17 break in half in flight. The Germans did not come back. Whether they had run low on fuel after the long climb to intercept, whether they assumed the damaged bomber would not make it home, or whether they regrouped to chase a different element of the formation is not clear from surviving records. Remaining German fighters in the area broke off and did not press a second attack on Bragg's section. The formation crossed the Tunisian coast outbound. Bragg started a very gradual descent, about 100 feet per minute, no more, to conserve the airframe and give the crew a slow change in pressure. He kept his airspeed pinned at 130 indicated. Faster and the slipstream loads on the tail would build. Slower and the airplane would start to wallow. He used aileron and differential power for almost all of his small course corrections. He used rudder only when nothing else would do. He had Burbridge come up out of the nose and stand behind the cockpit to act as a second set of eyes. He had the waist gunners move forward to redistribute weight away from the damaged section. He had Sarpolis, in the tail, stay still. Inside the radio compartment, Galloway tried to raise Biskra. He got through. The message that went back was brief, factual, and would be remembered by the operations officer, who received it as one of the strangest combat reports of his career. All-American 3 was returning. The aircraft was damaged. The tail was nearly severed. The hydraulic system was gone. The crew was uninjured. Estimated time of arrival at Biskra was approximately 13:30 local. They were requesting clear airspace and a long landing roll. From the moment of impact to touchdown was just over 90 minutes. The cabin temperature climbed from -40 at altitude into the teens Fahrenheit as Bragg descended. The crew kept their oxygen masks on through 10,000 feet, then took them off and breathed the dry, thin air of the African winter. The engines ran smoothly. Fuel consumption at the reduced cruise was lower than briefed. Structural sounds did not get worse, though several crew members later reported a constant, low-frequency groaning from the rear of the fuselage that sounded, as one of them put it in debrief, like a tree about to fall. Bragg flew the airplane with his hands and feet, and his attention turned almost entirely backwards. He could not see the tail from his seat. He had to fly the front of the airplane while imagining what was happening at the rear. The escorting B-17s stayed with him, one off each wing, half a mile back so that their slipstream would not buffet the damaged ship. As the formation crossed back into Algerian airspace and the country below changed from green to ochre to the gray-brown of the high desert, Bragg ran through his options for the approach to Biskra in his head and on a notepad. He had no flaps. He had no brakes. The tailwheel was retracted and would not come down. The hydraulic system that operated it was gone. The main landing gear could be cranked down by hand, but doing so took 20 minutes per side, and someone would have to climb back through the airplane to do it. The flight engineer, Joe C. James, volunteered. He moved aft very carefully, found the hand crank for the right main gear, and started cranking. After roughly 20 minutes of work, with the floor flexing under him each time he shifted his weight, he reported the right main locked down. He moved to the left side and started again. The left main gear was harder. The cable run had been damaged near the brake. James worked the crank for nearly half an hour. He got the wheel down. He could not tell from his position whether it had locked. The crew agreed to assume it had. The tail wheel was a different problem. The hand crank for the tail wheel was located in a section of the fuselage that was now separated from solid structure. Reaching it would require crawling across the part of the floor that was being held together by control cables. Bragg ordered the tail wheel left up. The B-17 would land on its mains and slide the tail down onto whatever was still there. Biskra came up on the horizon as a smudge of brown against brown, with the white smear of the runway visible to the northwest. The control tower had been told to clear the field. 2 ambulances and a fire truck were standing by. Bragg called the tower on the VHF set, reported his position and his intentions, and asked for a long straight-in approach with no turns tighter than absolutely necessary. The tower agreed. The escorting B-17s peeled off and entered the pattern behind him to clear the strip. Bragg made one long descending turn from the south, lined up on the dirt runway at about 3 miles out, and began his final approach without flaps, without effective brakes, and without a tailwheel. His airspeed was high, his sink rate was low. The crew, except for Sarpolis and James working the gear, was in crash positions. The touchdown was clean. Mains hit the dirt at roughly 110 miles an hour, a good 25 knots faster than a standard B-17 landing, and Bragg held the nose level with elevator long enough for the tail to settle on its own. The fuselage groaned audibly as the tail came down. The empennage stayed attached. The aircraft rolled out for nearly the full length of the Biskra strip. Bragg used engine reversal as best he could by cutting and feathering, and the dirt itself provided drag, and came to a stop near the end of the runway, with the brakes still inoperative and the airframe intact. Ground crew that drove out to meet the aircraft included the squadron's engineering officer, a flight surgeon, and a press photographer attached to the 12th Air Force Public Information Detachment. The flight surgeon climbed up first and found the crew shaken but uninjured. Sarpolis had to be lifted out through the side of the rear fuselage rather than crawling forward, because the floor under him was no longer trustworthy. Burbridge climbed down on his own. Bragg climbed down on his own. The press photographer walked around to the rear of the airplane, looked at the tail, and exposed several frames of film. Those photographs went out by courier to Algiers, were processed, and reached the Stars and Stripes North African edition within days. Within a few weeks, they were in Life magazine in the United States. The image of All-American 3 on the apron at Biskra, with the empennage hanging off the back of the airplane and the control cables visible through the gap, became the most widely circulated B-17 damage photograph of the war. It was used by Boeing in internal materials about structural redundancy. It was used by the Army Air Forces in recruitment. It was used after the war in nearly every popular history of the daylight bombing campaign published in the United States. Boeing engineers examining the photographs and the aircraft itself estimated that the empennage had been held to the fuselage by something on the order of 6 square feet of intact aluminum skin along the dorsal seam, plus the surviving control cables. The aircraft was repaired in theater. Much of the tail section was replaced using parts cannibalized from another damaged B-17, and returned to combat. She flew more missions out of North Africa before being reassigned to operations against Southern Europe. Squadron records held in the U.S. Army Center of Military History indicate she was eventually salvaged later in 1943, though the exact disposition is not fully documented. Kendrick Bragg finished his combat tour with the 97th. He was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for the Bizerte mission. He flew again. He survived the war. He returned to civilian life in North Carolina and rarely talked publicly about the mission, though he gave a handful of interviews to historians in later decades. Several of his crew survived the war as well. At least 2 were killed in subsequent operations with other crews. Burbridge survived. Sarpolis survived. James survived. The crew never flew together again as a full unit after All-American 3 went into the depot for repair. What kept the airplane in the air across those 90 minutes from Bizerte to Biskra was a combination of structural design, control surface geometry, and one pilot's decision to fly the front of the airplane as if the back of it was made of glass. The B-17 had been designed by engineers in Seattle in the mid-1930s, who argued against the Army's own specifications that the bomber needed more skin and more structure than the requirements called for. On February 1, 1943, that argument was settled over the Tunisian coast.